With the increased use of cloud providers such as AWS and Azure, it leaves the data center engineer thinking, what's next and where do I fit in? Let's explore the cloud's future in a conversation I'm calling The On-Premises Data Center is Dead. Long live on-premises data center. Joining me today, I've got two fellow vExperts. Gentlemen, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Hi, thanks for having me on the podcast here. My name is Trevor Pott, and I am a tech writer, sysadmin, and professional pain in the butt on Twitter.
My name is Ariel Sanchez. Thank you so much, Paul, for having me on. I'm a system administrator focused on VMware for the second biggest call center company in the world, so enterprise.
All right, thank you guys. So I'll just kick this off. What I see, and a lot of this is going to be, I'm going to start with actual useful information, and I'm going to throw some personal opinions in here. I'm definitely starting to see in the upper Midwest area more and more medium and large size businesses looking to get into cloud offerings. Whether or not that fits them, that is an argument that we have back and forth. But people see it and they think they need it. They think they have to have it. What do you see in your market spaces on like a weekly, daily basis?
Honestly, let Trevor answer first. He probably has seen much more than I have.
Well, I mean, okay, so it's kind of interesting. I live mostly in the small business space, sort of up into the medium space. And I can't generalize. I mean, as much as I would love to make some grandiose generalization here, I think that the only one that's valid is that it's time to stop talking about whether or not you should move into the public cloud or whatnot as though it was some giant all-consuming thing that requires ridiculous quantities of planning and must be some big block shift. It's not. It's just another way that we can consume resources, and it comes with its own benefits and its own downfalls. And every single organization is going to be different, even within a single market vertical, because how we employ our technology and how we mold our business processes to that technology and vice versa is what creates the differentiation between organizations. And it's what gives one company a competitive advantage over the next. So I think that regardless of the size of the company or the market vertical, you're going to have some organizations that go out and think public cloud is a great idea and some that don't. And for some, it'll be a huge success. For some, it's not. And I think what we're seeing here is that now that we've moved past, into a large sense, the hype cycle portion of this equation, people are more willing to sit down and look at what is the actual benefits, what's the downsides, and what are the real world complexities of trying to integrate this. And I'm seeing less and less that people are talking about, let's move everything into the cloud or let's keep everything on-prem. And they're just talking about hybrid solutions or using point solutions in the cloud for specific things, just as a fact of life. As though it's not anything special or scary.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. It really comes to, does this make sense for my problem, my business processes? And once you actually evaluate it, you figure out the value, you figure out the advantages, disadvantages. And I do believe that hybrid is going to be the way forward until some other requirements are met. But we can go into detail a bit more, but I do think that it's here to stay. It's something to add to our tool chest, just like Trevor said.
And it's less about individual market verticals so much as it is classifications of applications. So like a great example of this is when you're looking at point of sale software, you're looking at accounting software, that sort of thing, especially for small and medium businesses. A lot of that stuff isn't going to live on-prem anymore because the developers just aren't making it for on-prem anymore. Or the stuff that they're making on-prem and they're hauling along 30-year-old legacy code bases that are spectacularly difficult to manage, maintain, and use. But all of those same companies have an online version now that are essentially they've been rewritten. They've been rewritten and they've been streamlined as part of that process. And so I think people are moving to them less because it's public cloud or it's subscription or anything, and more just because, hey, somebody rewrote this at some point in the past 30 years, so a lot of the cruft has been rethought.
I totally agree. I mean, things like Workday, for example, for managing HR, which normally was, a huge project in every company to implement, they have changed the game. So,
and I think that's another thing that when we're talking about the stats and we're talking about use cases and whatnot, that people don't really take into account when they're talking about public cloud versus on premises, is they confuse why organizations embrace or adopt, for example, software as a service or whatnot. In many cases, they're not embracing this because they're really enamored of the public cloud model or they're really enamored of the subscription model, but because when you just look at the actual software that's on offer, it's the least butts and easiest to use solution that's available.
Yeah. And a follow-up topic there is, when does it make sense to keep on-prem, and when does it make sense to go to try or to maybe force cloud? But it's definitely, Trevor already said it, it's definitely something that each company has to value at their juncture in time, wherever they are.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, when you ask questions like when does it make sense to use something on premises, one of the quickest examples that jumps to my mind is just when you have a lot of data that you have to do something with on premises, there's not a lot of people have access to cheap, high-speed internet, enough that you could, for example, run your manufacturing plant with all of your storage and processing in the cloud. You're still going to need some great big pharma servers with a bunch of data sitting on premises. And maybe you farm your backups out, or maybe you run your websites using public cloud or VoIP or something. I mean, I can't think of a single company, my own included, that doesn't use some form of public cloud backed service. But I also can't think of anyone really that's running it all in public cloud at this point.
Looking down the road, do you see a shift away from internal data centers and more to the hybrid cloud offering? Because my theory, my thought is data center as it exists now, and is much like when it existed 5 years ago, it's not going to be anything like it was, and it's not going to be anything like it is today. Where you're going to have companies that are going to look at the OpEx and the CapEx savings of moving things to the cloud, whether it's file servers or, as you stated, Trevor, applications already being written for the cloud versus on-premises solutions. So I see, especially in the way I see in like local markets, the smaller the shop, the more adoption of cloud. But again, you're still going to want some services on site. You're still going to want those heavy-duty files that, again, if you don't have the correct pipe, you're not going to move CAD files to the cloud. You're not going to move large graphic files to the cloud. But where do you see data centers moving to over the next few years?
Okay, well, let me try to qualify a few things here. First of all, I think it's important to really draw the distinction between public, private, and hybrid clouds here. Now, I know a lot of people, when they say cloud, they by default mean the public cloud. But over the next 18 months, cloud in a can solutions for on-premises are going to become cheap and plentiful. There are already a bunch of them out there. I personally know of at least a dozen more coming out over the next 2 years. And it's simply going to become the default way that we consume on-premises infrastructure by the year 2020. And I will stand by that one. I mean, it's becoming that easy. And I think that will change a lot of this momentum that's going towards let's consume the public cloud all the time, because now we'll be able to consume on-premises stuff just as easily. The addendum to that is that we long ago reached the point where most of us stopped needing faster processors. And we're starting, at least on the server side, to stop reaching the point where we need more RAM to do everything. I mean, okay, there's always going to be the extreme workload. There's always going to be the exception that's going to want lots of CPU, lots of RAM or whatever. But the reality of it is, most small and medium businesses, we can cram pretty much everything we need to do into one or two nodes now. Admittedly, beefy nodes, but 5 years down the road, that where you had to dedicate half a floor to a data center, you can crush that down into one or two racks. And when you start looking at the efficiencies that we're increasingly able to get, and the fact that the demand for compute power is not increasing at the same speed as the hardware is progressing, I think that this is going to keep workloads, at least some of them, on-prem essentially forever, and move us towards more hybrid cloud solutions where we can run what we need to run most of the time on-prem, but it can burst out if we need it to.
Hey Trevor, question for you. When you said cloud in a can, would Azure Stack fit that model where it's basically Azure but it's in yours?
I think Azure Stack is probably the most advanced and probably most well-tested cloud in a can at this point. But fully expect cloud in a can to come from Nutanix. Maybe if VMware ever gets their crap together, and there's about a dozen others who are pulling it together. You can already get cloud in a can from Yottabyte, for example. It was a dream 3 years ago, and it's a reality today, and it's going to be a commodity by 20.
Yeah. And one thing that really helps those decisions is, do you already have a bunch of stuff, or is it all new? Because if you already have it, and your costs are very well known, you can actually compare. Okay, what would this run for me against? I already made this investment. It doesn't mean that I need to get rid of it. Well, no. Sometimes, and especially because you're running your own stuff and not paying someone else to do it, it normally will come out cheaper. But
I think also when you actually start running the numbers, though, it's very rare for the public cloud to actually come out cheaper. I mean, it is if you're, say, starting a two-man shop and you've got 4 workloads. But as soon as you've got 40 workloads, that conversation changes.
Yeah, and this is something that, cloud is great if you can't really put a finger on what you will need in a year or 2 years, because you have the capacity there. You just go with the growth. But if your workload is very stable and you already bought servers that, realistically, whether you bought them with a 3-year or 5-year warranty, those things will keep running as long as you want the risk to remain. And normally you will not spend more if you already have it. But if you're trying to do a new company, like you were saying, or if you're trying to set up something completely different from what it was before, you're not only getting the hosting, but you're also getting all these processes and automation, which for me is the real thing, the real difference, I guess, in cloud consumption.
I don't disagree, but there is a dark negative to the public cloud that technologists in general dance around, and American technologists especially, and that is trust. Trust is a key component of
and this is why
outsourcing. And quite frankly, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but that's become something of a problem for American public cloud providers lately.
Even though they all claim to be certified in everything, a lot of people will not put their workloads, and this is why Azure Stack is actually something that people are paying attention to. Oh, you mean I can get whatever you have, but it will be in my premises on my hard drives?
Or you look at Stratoscale, bringing AWS stuff to you. There are so many now that to choose from that can provide you something very similar or essentially identical to the public cloud versions. There's no longer this need for the binary choice. Run it old school without automation, without processes, without whatever, or run it in the public cloud and get all this other stuff. Now you can have the best of both worlds if that's what you want.
One thing that I see, especially other companies that I've been talking to, other colleagues, is that increasingly people that are working in enterprise shops that have a certain model that are traditionally, and let's be honest, they're still viewed as a cost center, as a cost of doing business. We're being forced more and more to prove that we can do the same things at a lower price so that people don't need to shop outside. And, one of the things that also comes with it, and something that perhaps we can discuss here, is getting the right people. Because, it's very true that there is a shortage of talent for someone that will actually take all the value that you're supposed to take out of the cloud. There's a bunch of administrators.
I agree with that one.
Yeah, but if you think about all the enterprise administrators that you would think that you would come in next day and tell them, hey, Amazon and GCP, come on, get this going. They're all Windows, they're all VMware administrators, and they will need to learn a bunch of stuff.
Yes, you're right. They would need to learn a bunch of stuff, and it would take them 3 weeks. I'm sorry, but I don't buy the whole there is a shortage of talent. What there is a shortage of people willing to work below living wage. And I see a lot of people exiting the IT administrative market, going pretty much anywhere else because they don't get burned out. The hours are better. They get treated less like crap in other industries, and they get paid better. And, I realize in the US, this is a slightly different story because wages for IT people are significantly higher than pretty much anywhere else in the rest of the world. But even there, it's starting to happen. The wages are being depressed. And this is essentially due not to the fact that there's an actual shortage of talent, but due to the fact that there's a pretty concerted effort to go out there and drive the wages of the geeks down because, geeks have been traditionally pretty expensive.
But here's a paradox. The people that are supposedly the best at doing these things are charging amazing salaries.
Sure.
Because they're automating other tasks out of the place, right?
Absolutely. I'm not going to say that it's impossible to go out there and get great wages, because it is possible, but the market is so non-deterministic in this sense. And I think that is largely driven by the fact that employers just don't understand IT. And so you'll get some which get it enough that they can go out there and they can start hiring people in bulk, and they realize that, there are ways that you can train up nerds if that's what you really want. And it's relatively cheap and easy to take a bunch of vSphere nerds, for example, and turn them into AWS nerds if that's what you really want to do.
Right. They're infrastructure guys.
Yeah, or you can just, go out and say, hey, we're firing all of our vSphere nerds, but we're going to hire 300 AWS nerds, and you can essentially shift the burden of that training and the cost of that training back onto the individuals as opposed to paying out for it as a company. And this is, you get some companies that do that. Some companies will decide that they're really going to build a long-term relationship with their staff members. But I think that the latter are significantly rarer, and they're becoming rarer over time.
And I'm glad you brought this up, because now I think that the most valuable thing about your current employees is that they have a better understanding of your business problems, and they can call bullshit faster. They know when someone is not gonna work. And honestly, like we've been saying, cloud and AWS, even vCloud Air or whatever you want to insert into there, is a tool. But
Exactly.
if you can grab your people and tell them, listen, this is the problem that we want to solve, and they become knowledge. They not only do they know the business process, they also know what they're comparing against. So one thing that I've been mentioning actually in the vExperts Slack is that the cloud is going to make us all billing experts, and someone else said, and contract experts and security experts. So all this knowledge about how the company works and how what things would actually work, because honestly, most you look at AWS and their offerings, they're cookie cutter. They're really, this is what we offer. You go ahead and build what you want. But building the right thing at the right cost with the right provisions, it only comes from understanding the business.
Well, yes. I mean, essentially, what is required and where the real money is, and where essentially the future of all IT rests, is not in being the guy who gets paid to swap out disks or chant some dark incantation over a RAID array. It's in being what amounts to a technologically savvy project manager with some understanding of business requirements that can sit there in a meeting and go, look, we have this problem. Now here's the different ways that we can solve it. And somebody who can not only go and, lead the team of nerds, but because a lot of these solutions have now been automated from infrastructure even through to coding, that could sit down and knock together prototypes of a lot of these solutions and start defining things like unit tests and regression testing and automated metrics and monitoring, and who can think about the fact that there are all these additional things that have to go into how you're putting together a proper infrastructure. It's that architect level thinking with some level of business awareness. That's the bit that matters, because all of those jobs incanting over RAID arrays and writing simple shell scripts and swapping drives and all the rest of that, no, those are going away. You're just going to have the rack monkey, and you're going to have the architect and a few devs. And all the rest of that essential human middleware, that's what's being automated away, whether it's on-prem or it's in the cloud.
Totally agree. And really the mission, what our vision is and strategy and all these things that normally CEOs think about, you really need good leadership that understands a lot of what we're trying to achieve at what cost and what the value is before you actually go and tell the architects, this is what you go forth. But, that leadership has to be really strong.
Well, and I think, it's interesting that we got here from a discussion about public versus private cloud. But again, it keeps coming back to trust for me. You talk about leadership, but I think just as important is that there exists trust between those architect level positions and the executives, because the executives have to trust those architects enough to say, here is our actual problem, here is what we're trying to achieve, here are our resources. Now, what do you think? I mean, if you limit the inputs that you give them, you get significantly worse outputs. And I think that when you have to start talking about in truly business level decisions, legal considerations, data sovereignty considerations, how are you going to deal with protecting customer data, designing that protection in by default if you're going to be in compliance with general data protection regulations in the European Union, for example. You have to design that thinking straight into your databases, into your backups, into your test and dev procedures. It's not just something you can address at an infrastructure level. And you truly need somebody, a lot of somebodies, preferably all your technical somebodies, who can not only be trusted with business direction and business concerns, but be trusted to stand up to that CEO and say, hey, I think your decision here is wrong. I think you've made a bad call. And because of that, this technical solution is going to cause us trouble.
Yeah. And go for it.
And I think where that is going to matter the most and where it is practiced the least is in government.
Very true. And here's another thing that maybe some people have already experienced, but when you are a customer for a cloud provider and you're not, you're probably not going to be their biggest customer. One thing that is quite different from, having a co-location versus a cloud provider is the level of customer service and the commitments that they have with you. So in those cases, when you really have a real problem, sometimes it's not that easy to get that person on the phone that you need to talk to, or, when a whole region, and happens seldomly, but it happens. When there's a big outage and your business is really affected, sometimes people just get emails back. So there's a lot to say about that, still having that level of control, not only for your data and your processes, but also being able to fix your own problems when they really matter to you.
Well, and I think where a lot of the religious fervor comes into this public versus private debate is that it's viewed as such a binary option. So, again, people are talking about, well, you're going to move all your stuff in, or you're going to move all your stuff out, or you're going to, if the public cloud goes down, you are totally in trouble because all your workloads are gone. And I don't think that in the real world that's the way it works. I'm sure, again, that there are exceptions, but, even in the small business world, we can look at this and go, hey, these 30 workloads, if these aren't working, you might as well turn the entire company off and send everybody home, because we can't do anything and there's no purpose to paying these people to stand here. But these 50 workloads, if they go down, the worst case scenario is that a couple of customers call in and say, oh, your website's down, or I can't find this thing, or maybe I can't make an order. So it's not the end of the world. And if they're down for an hour or two, okay, we can accept that a few hours every year out as a downtime in exchange for never having to worry about this and all of this automation and process the public cloud is going to take away from us. And I think that it's those kind of business trade-offs that you need to have an understanding of business priorities, and you need to have an understanding of what your workloads do and who your internal customers are in order to properly make an assessment about whether to toss that up to the public cloud or keep some investment on premises.
Yeah, and there's also the big conversation of, well, when you move it to a cloud, you're designing for the cloud. You're thinking about not having just one, the cats versus pet thing. You don't have just one pet here. You put your stuff around, and if one provider fails, then you have the other options. Yep.
So some of the houseplants are ornamental, and some of them produce fruit.
So with the last few minutes here in our podcast, I do want to shift gears slightly. It actually goes back to something you said a little bit earlier, Trevor. So forward-looking, hybrid cloud. Not everything's going to go away internal, and obviously not everything's going to be again up in AWS or in Azure. What does that human middleware, as you put it, do to not get lost in the shuffle, to keep up with changes? Do you think looking at some of these cloud certifications is important? Is it more automation? Personally, I've always kind of considered myself forward-looking, and I've really shifted gears. Obviously, I'm a big VMware guy, and I will still continue to do that. But I don't think I'm going to pursue the vCAPs or the vCDX anymore as I originally planned, whereas I'm looking at keeping up with VMware and then adding AWS and Azure as like a component of that. Where do we think that's going?
There are tens of millions of IT practitioners in the world, developers, architects, infrastructure geeks, and those who call themselves sysadmin by various different counts range anywhere from 15 to 20 million. I can't say 15, 20 million people should go out and get an Azure certificate, because then there's going to be flevendy squillion of them that are just surplus. The reality of it is, if you want to advance your career while at the same time coping with change, you must do the same thing that everybody has always done, and that is find the thing that nobody else wants to do or that nobody else is doing, but is still vitally important. Go learn that. Don't follow the crowd. Don't do the easy thing, because that's what everybody's going to do. And for me, personally, I think that this is going to be, for the next few years anyways, some of the more in-depth security and more obscure security areas, specifically practical regulatory compliance. I think that things like automated incident response, even software-defined WAN and the implementation and utilization of software-defined WAN, both for acceleration purposes and for security purposes, the extension of microsegmentation out through software-defined WAN, for example, these are going to be areas that not a lot of people are really putting a lot of time and effort into, and yet the demand for them is rising because they're increasingly becoming important. Another good example is to think of the Internet of Things. Everybody took the easy route out, and now we're all screwed. So there's going to be a lot of money to be made in whoever can find a way to make sure that all of those little gizmos that we're constantly deploying corporately, personally, etc., don't screw this business in particular or that government in particular. But it's a really hard problem. And not a lot of people seem to want to actually put any effort into it.
Yeah, the topic of the human middleware is something I'm passionate about. And this is one of the reasons why in B. Brownback, I didn't mention that, on the Brownback crew, we are always looking at, what can we provide to people that they want to learn and will help them. And the same as you, Paul, I come from the VMware background, and I love VMware. It's basically what has opened so many doors for me. And I do find value, for example, in the VCDX still, because the main thing about VCDX is that you have to understand the businesses and the business problems. And that's training that you can't go to get any cert and you get it. You have to do, there's a lot of reading and a lot of actual work that you have to put into yourself to actually get to the level of the architect that the VCDX is aiming for. So, even though you may see that the world is big and IT grows, everybody is going to find something to do, hopefully, right? And even though there's old stuff, there's still people doing old stuff and people that find new stuff to do. But I do think that VMware has, at least with the design, and maybe not the VCAP design as much as a valuable certification, but I do think that the VCDX and that level certification is very valuable. One thing that I love about VMware is that it was the first product that asked us to think about infrastructure. So we're not just the server guys, we're also involved in the network and the storage. So I think that there's a lot of us that can still grow in that, broad base. There's a lot of people that are still learning networking, more advanced than just, switch and VLAN, but actually are now getting into routing and IGMP and other things that are more, data center switching, for example. I see a lot of people going into more dev-oriented things. This comes from the automation, and we've seen it a lot with VMware administrators that say, "Oh, hold on, I can do this with Power CLI," and that tends to scale and grow, and people find that they like this. But Trevor brought up a great point, and this is one of the things that I see in the companies that my friends work in and I work in, is that security and compliance is paramount. It's important. It's growing. It's a big problem. It needs new solutions, and those solutions change every year. So there's definitely a lot to do that way. There's a lot to do. Just keep on growing whatever exists today. There is new IT, and I think Trevor mentioned this when file servers, web servers, those things are kind of, we all know how that works. But IoT, like Trevor mentioned, business intelligence, this huge deployments of containers and the automation and orchestration that they need, all of those things are new. And, there's a bunch of open source. And I think that the main thing that has changed in the last 5 years is, open source is not only, it used to be the thing that everybody thought, okay. But now it is the de facto thing that you want to have. If you want to have your resume pop out, you want to have open source there. You want to say that you understand at least the ecosystems. So, there's all the human middleware will find something to do. Whether they love it, that's up to them to decide to put in the hours to find what they love.
And I think that one thing to also add to this is don't just chase the newest. Also, remember how much IT is out there that is really, really freaking old. And that the people who know how to do this are retiring in droves. I mean, there is still a lot of money to be made going out and learning to program in COBOL, learning to run mainframes, that sort of stuff. There's a lot less money, running a bunch of contemporary IT solutions where there are millions of administrators that know how to do it. But there's always these niches, especially in older systems or bespoke systems, that can be really interesting. And if you're looking for a new challenge, don't just look at what's new. Take the chance and opportunity to look at what's really old. You might find something you love there.
Yeah, one of the subgroups of IT and sysadmin that I really admire are the BSD people, because those people, they've been doing what I consider, infrastructure now, where they're talking networking, they're talking storage, they're talking applications and this and that. They've been doing it forever out of the same OS. So they really have, there's a lot to be learned from the previous generations of system admins and how they're still adapting, using old things and new things.
Take your local gray beard or gray braid out for a beer. Mm-hmm. Learn what they know.
Go to your BSD user groups. They're phenomenal.
Well, gentlemen, I do want to thank you for your time, and this has been a great discussion. I actually have not had to chime in much. You've both steered this quite well. So, in closing here, where can our listening audience find you gentlemen on the internet, whether it's Twitters, blogs, or other projects you are working on currently?
I guess I am on Twitter at cake_not_a lie.
And I'm on Twitter at Ariel Sanchez Mora, and hopefully Paul can include it because I'm not going to spell it.
Yes, of course. Blogs and Twitter accounts will be linked in the posting with the podcast.
I really appreciate the time and inviting me, Paul. And Trevor, it's we could talk for hours, but I'm amazed that we couldn't find something. I honestly agree with you a lot. So I was hoping that we could find something that we could really get into and have some fun later.
Well, I am sure that in some future podcast, we will argue about something glorious. Thank you very much for having us on, Paul.
Yes,
thank you.
And I will see if I can find a topic where we can get into some heated debates in the future.
All right.
One more time, thank you to my guests, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to join the conversation on today's topic or be a guest on a future episode of the ExploreVM podcast, reach out to me on Twitter at ExploreVM or email me, paul@explorevm.com. And once again, thank you for listening to the ExploreVM podcast.